Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today, we're going to be taking an exploration of the American stained glass industry with Megan McElfresh. Before we get started today, I just wanted to go over a couple quick things with you. First of all, this is being recorded, so you will all be receiving a copy of the recording tomorrow around 1 o'clock, along with some other details about the webinar. If you experience any troubles during the webinar, such as slides not to be advancing, sounds getting weird, best thing you can do is just close down the webinar, click the link that was sent to you, and sign back in that way. Likewise, if you're on the phone, same thing, hang up, call back in, and that'll solve 99% of the problems you're experiencing. We will be taking questions at the end of today's webinar, but please feel free to type them in any time into the chat box, and we'll get those answered once Megan finishes today. So we have with us today Megan McElfresh. She's a third-generation stained glass artisan, and she's the executive director of the Stained Glass Association of America, which is a trade association that deals with stained glass. Megan, I will turn things over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here doing this today. As mentioned, I'm Megan McElfresh. I'm a third-generation stained glass artisan and a glass science nut. And I'm here at the helm of an amazing crew that manages the Stained Glass Association of America out of our offices here in Buffalo, New York. I love doing this stuff. I love sharing as much as possible about architectural stained glass, its history, where it is, how it got to be there, what's happening in our world today. And an hour never seems like enough time. So I love to jump right in, since I figure anybody can Google more about my bio and what we do here. We have a ton of resources on stainedglass.org. So no reason to eat up precious minutes with that. I do have several spaces marked in my talk reminding me to slow down, because I know I'll get too excited as we go through, but feel free to, drop messages in if it sounds like I'm off to the races and I need to take a breath or something and slow down. And then I'm around to answer as many questions as possible at the end. What I love about connecting with parallel communities like Heritage Ohio is that if we're ever going to make a dent into leveling the playing field in preservation, conservation, we need to break down the silos. We need to dig tunnels between the trenches so that we can better understand the fields we engage with, because it makes it easier to tell the core stories about what we do and tackle these big issues. So getting right into it. The earliest known stained glass windows are in the Augsburg Cathedral in Bavaria, Germany. The maker is unknown. The exact origin is unknown. Some historians believe that the windows were created when the cathedral itself was consecrated, and could be from the year 1065. Others hold the opinion that the panels could not possibly date back any further than the first half of the 12th century. So, it's kind of a shtick. One of the big questions I always get is, who made my windows? We don't know. We don't know who made most of the windows out there. And that starts with the very beginning. We've always been a trade. It's only recently that this big deal started getting made about who made the windows, signing our work, things like that. One of our foremost, I'm sure you've all seen this picture out there on the internet, one of today's foremost stained glass artists, who I adore, Judah Schechter, is fond of saying that stained glass peaked in the 13th century and it's been downhill from there. And as makers, it's hard not to empathize with that statement. These 15 13th century stained glass windows from Saint-Chapelle in France are composed of symbolic panels enameled with allusions to royalty, coronation scenes, borders with fleur-de-lis and castles and all kinds of amazing architectural elements. As makers, what was really awesome about this time in our field's history is that it's the only notable time in our history where architecture was designed around the windows rather than the windows being an afterthought of the architecture. This common story that we are told as people involved with stained glass, whether we're the stewards, whether we're the caretakers, whether we're making it today and preserving it, I know we've all heard the story that stained glass was a visual literacy thing. It rose to popularity because it illustrated stories during a time when people couldn't read. But the core function of stained glass was to bring light into our buildings. And I think that's why Judah Schechter's quote resonates so much with some of us today. Because just saying that stained glass is around to tell stories, I think really is a misnomer for how much the field has been through the ages. But we don't have time for the whole history of stained glass. Let's talk about stained glass in America. In 1843, the first known American-made figural window, the Nativity for Christ Church in Pelham, New York, was designed and created by the Bolton brothers. And as construction exploded across America, that style was really, it was all the rage, influenced by so many people coming to America to settle, this royal Bavarian sort of stained glass establishment. It's fully painted compositions meant to really harken back to the European windows that reminded people of home. The windows are very, very richly colored, very richly decorated, and were very, very popular with benefactors funding these massive church projects springing up across America in the mid 1800s. So this is what was being asked for. This is what people were used to. This is what early American stained glass was like. And for the first 30, 40 years of American stained glass, that's all that's happening. The other thing that's happening is that as more buildings are being made, the demand for those windows are increasing, and there's not enough American craftsmen to build them all. There's also a price differentiation, a price difference that's happening. You have German, Scottish, and English glass houses setting up sales firms in New York, in Boston, to capitalize on that expansion that's happening very, very quickly, bringing windows across from Europe. And those windows are cheaper by a third than what we are making in America. So that's all impacting the American industry trying to get off the ground not that long ago, in about 1870. So these American studios that are trying to get started are struggling to compete with imports made by workers overseas being paid less than half of American workers at the time. So how do we jump from that to buildings full of American stained glass, to the Tiffany's and Lafarges and the things that we think of today when we think of American stained glass? That's where the Stained Glass Association of America comes in. About 40 firms get together and create the Glass Workers Union, and they approach Congress and they say, we can't compete. We cannot get this industry off the ground. We need help. Please create tariffs to equalize European wages with American wages in our industry, because it's a difference of almost 3 to 1. And the group, it took 10 years for the group to be successful. They started in 1893, and the group was successful, and tariffs were passed in 1903. And that year, the Glass Union officially became the National Ornamental Glass Manufacturers Association, which was later shortened to the Stained Glass Association of America. And at that, over the course of those 10 years, there were 26 men that consistently came together across 45 stained glass firms to create that economic force and help get the industry off the ground. And that's the same Stained Glass Association of America that we are today. Because even once they passed tariffs, they still had major economic issues. They still had to find materials. They still had educational problems. They had issues with windows being built that weren't holding up, that weren't architecturally sound. So the need for a trade association to help create regulations and standards for the industry was very clear after that first 10 years. And this is actually our home base. This is where our offices are. You're seeing Trinity Episcopal Buffalo, and we just celebrated our 120th anniversary right here in this space. So as these studios are popping up, something else that's happening is that as you can tell, this is not Munich style Bavarian stained glass anymore. Manufacturing has had an impact on stained glass. So as the studios are coming together, as they're fighting economic issues, they're also undergoing an artistic transformation. And this is in part a material issue. I could talk just for the next 4 hours about the founding of American materials in our industry. It is fascinating and fantastic. But long story short, we have to tackle major material sourcing in America because most of them are coming from Europe. It is a trade competition. It is definitely an economic issue. And so as we're establishing the medium as a trade in America and getting materials, it just so happens that we have great studios, and most of us have heard of Tiffany and Lafarge, who are going to glass houses that are established in America and saying, no, I don't want this clear glass that I'm going to paint on. I want to paint with the glass. You've been trying to get that tin and copper and all that stuff out of the glass and make it pristine and pretty and perfectly flat and clear. Throw it all back in. I want the glass to do the work. I want to paint with light. And those two forces, on top of this expansion of buildings, flooding through what we now call, the Rust Belt, this industrial revolution that's happening, are really all the perfect pieces that you need for the stained glass industry to finally become a resilient force in America. It is also the reason why the vast majority of our windows in America are at a point of crisis all at the same time, because they're all about the same age. They've all sort of been through the same sort of storyline here. And that is what is happening. So the American stained glass industry continues to build up. And what I find so interesting, we're going to talk about Tiffany windows. There's Tiffany images all over everything I talk about, but there were 45 glass firms that founded the American industry, that came together and decided, like, hey, we need a way to communicate. Let's start a printed journal. We have one of the oldest continuously published trade journals in the United States. I am proud to say we've now made it through 2 world wars and 2 pandemics, and are still going strong, still printing the stained glass quarterly that started as the Bulletin in 1906. Those 45 firms established patterns and designs and pricing guidelines to help lift up young studios that were getting established in America, so that we really have just as many studios in America today as we've ever had. And I think that's a really awesome thing, because I think we all know Tiffany, and his studio didn't last very long. And this idea that stained glass is dead, right, is pretty prevalent. But we are a very, very healthy industry, and always have been right from the get-go. Like, came together, formed a community of peers that have kept things going. So, these are some, I love these historic photos. It all started with very industrial, like, we were part of the building trades. We still are today. So these guys could go out, they could install these historic storefront windows, and then they could go to the back of the shop and start painting, start cutting, start glazing windows. And I love that part of our history. And then as it moved into residential work, they worked together to establish pricing guidelines. So you didn't have pricing continuing to undercut the industry, continuing to work against the health and well-being of these early businesses. And so today, it is not uncommon to have third and fourth and fifth generation studios still at work in the United States. And how cool is that? I just love that. So get back to pretty stuff. So the history of American stained glass is really defined by this attitude that we're going to break away from the historic way of painting on glass with glass paints, which are basically ground up glasses mixed with oils and then fired onto the surface to become permanent. We're going to quote unquote paint with the glass. Tiffany once quipped that mosaics are the parent of stained glass. So the new American school of glass was really striving to produce, in essence, illuminated glass mosaics. And in the late 1800s, Louis Tiffany and John Lafarge have this pretty well-known, pretty infamous competitive streak that definitely certainly benefits the entire industry. They're both competing to sort of patent this new style of American stained glass, and that really involved them being a part of the entire process from start to finish, going to the manufacturers, describing the kind of glass they want, hanging out while the guys are casting the glass and pointing out what they want. I could also talk for the next 6 hours just about these two knuckleheads fighting over material, because they would stand at the factories, and if and John, like, not Lafarge, not to that extent, but there was extensive writing on Tiffany, having glass roll off the layer, cooled down out of the annealing ovens at the end, not liking that particular shade of green and smashing it all on the floor and having the manufacturer start again. It was a totally different way of involving themselves with the industry. So Lafarge and Tiffany initially have a friendship, but it gets bitter, it gets ugly. Their fight impacts everyone's access to glass. Everyone's access to glass. Tiffany's buying all the quote unquote good stuff as it comes off the line. A lot of other studios are left with browns and sort of pale pinks and very pale blues and sort of whatever's left over by the time Tiffany's done buying it all up. And I think it's amazing when you look at some of the historic glass, some of the the masterpieces that are made, considering this drama that's sort of unfolding back at some of the manufacturers. But thanks to their direction, we get this entirely new kind of material to work with, this entirely new stock. And I think when you look at these pictures that I have up now, you can see this is not flat glass, right? It's not just that it's a mix of colors. It is fully textured, folded, rippled glass. My favorite thing about giving tours is encouraging people to get right up under the windows and look straight up so that they can see the texture of the windows because it is just so intense. So we go very, very quickly in America from this. This is the only way that glass was made, is the cylinder method, the crown method, and they have perfected this. They have gotten the glass clear. There's, I love debunking old glass theories, and I still hear it all the time today. Oh, but glass is a very, very slow moving liquid and it's thicker at the bottom. It's just the way it was made. When you blow a rondelle, when you pull a cylinder, you've got an end that's thicker than the other, and the artisans put the thick side at the bottom. So we go really, really quickly. You think about it, stained glass hasn't changed for centuries. And in just a few decades of American stained glass, we go from one end of the spectrum to the other, just totally shift. And we still make glass today the way it was made. But now, even at those historic glass factories, and this is the historic factory out of Germany, Lambert's, that American movement sort of flows back and impacts those manufacturing studios as well. And that riot of color, that joy of light. I mean, if you think about it, from the 13th century to the early 1900s, we have very, very little change in this industry. And suddenly everything is different. Everything is different. And it really reinvigorates a lot of the artwork being done all over the world, which is just fantastic. All these new textures, all these new things happening as the manufacturers become part of the artistic process. And that's part of what we're still working with today, is part of this process. And we're going to circle back to that and talk to it at the end. So actually, the furnace that was built for Tiffany Studios in Kokomo, Indiana, is one of the 2 historic furnaces that are still operational today. And here you are seeing a young man go into the furnace. They packed it with the colorants, the metals, all the schmutz that we asked them to put back in the furnace. Now they've got it down to very specific formulations. They're going in there, they're grabbing some glass, and the American method is to pour, instead of blowing bubbles and creating rondelles and cylinders, they are pouring molten colors of glass onto graphite or steel tables, stirring it up at very specific times, and then throwing it into rollers, which are flattening the glass into sheets. And if they want a texture, they put a textured roller on top. Or they put on a spacesuit, get in there on the other side of the roller, and literally start folding the glass back on top of itself as it comes out. And this is still how we make glass today. Tiffany's going to walk in, he's going to shatter glass he doesn't like. Well, glass is expensive. It was expensive then, it's expensive now. Now, we've just learned how to harness that violence into glass. So one of those outbursts would become collage glass, where glass that has been shattered and strung out and flown around gets thrown back on the table. They pour new molten glass on top, and we end up with collage glass. So it's this incredible part of the process of material. And that's how we end up with racks of color to work with that look like this. And this is actually, you're looking at the archives at the Neustadt in Queens, where they still have original material from the Tiffany Studios. And they keep it the way he did, which is really, really useful when we're doing certain conservation projects, certain preservation work, and we can go back and look at the original material because it really was such a crucial part of the process. And I don't know why this is looking blurry. It's looking very blurry on my screen, but this is one of our glass racks today at the manufacturer today. So that's how we end up with this material. That's how we end up, as you can see, like literally when I am giving a tour, sometimes they'll say like, you have to get on top of it. It's drapery glass. And someone will say, oh, that's what it's called. And I was like, yes, but it's actual drapery. Get on top of it. Go look. Don't eat it, but get close enough to eat it. And that's how we go from the painted surface that we're used to this really incredible sculptural technique in just a short period of time. So, so that's the start. That's what's happening at the start of the American stained glass movement. Speaking of Tiffany Lafarge, those cranky dudes battling it out. One of the things I'm often asked, that I'm often and that we get emails about almost every day here at the office is, do I have a Tiffany or do I have Lafarge? How do I tell the difference? And going back to some of those stories, but obviously without having 6 hours to get into all of them. The easiest way I found to explain it is, if you look at the Tiffany window here, I think there's a way to make a laser light. If you look at this Tiffany window here, I was just showing a close-up of some of this drapery down here at the bottom of this window. The Tiffany windows have these massive pieces of fully draped, gorgeous, luscious glass that is pieced together to form the garments. The garments are literally draped glass. When you actually get up close to this Tiffany window in person, the rebar, the bars that are providing support for the window have had to be bent up and out and back around the glass, because this window is so dimensional that you can't get the bars close to the window to provide proper support. Over here in the Lafarge window, look at how he has used slivers, all these different slivers of glass to create the effect of drapery coming down the window. And you can sort of see his layering back here on the back side of this robe. You can definitely see the layering here. One of the things that's notable about the work that's going on is that they're not building a single window. They're plating and layering windows on top of windows on top of windows to create this incredible sense of depth. So it can be very difficult to tell the difference between the two. On top of which, how do I get back to my little thing? Oh, there we go. This is neither a Tiffany or a Lafarge. It's a lamb window. So remember those 45 other studios working at the time? Most of them are very quiet and not involved in the drama. They're just building great work. And their work is just as immense and impressive and luscious and wonderful. This is a lamb window at St. Mary's in Tuxedo Park, New York. And it's one of the other really impressive collections in the United States. There's very few locations where you can go where you can see both Tiffany's and Lafarge's in the same space and compare and contrast them without getting back in your car and driving to a different sacred space. And at St. Mary's, you've got Maitland Armstrong windows, Henry Wind Young, Louis Comfort Tiffany, John Lafarge, and Lamb Studios. J&R Lamb Studios was founded in 1857, well before the Lafarge Tiffany battle starts, and they are still a thriving studio today. They're the longest running stained glass and ecclesiastic art maker in the United States. So, yeah, we've all heard of Tiffany the same way we've all heard of Xerox. How many people actually have a Xerox? Like, they're Canons, they're Brothers, they're anything but a Xerox, but we still call them Xerox. And so, do you have a Tiffany? Maybe, but maybe it's a Lamb. Maybe it's a Maitland Armstrong. Maybe it's somebody else. And I think some of those other windows are sometimes even more brilliant than some of the Tiffany windows, maybe in part because the workers weren't embroiled in some dramatic competition. I'll have to do an academic paper or something on that one day. It's just a theory of mine, but I get to look at a lot of stained glass windows, and I think that this lamb window in particular, it's one of my favorites. It is so fantastic. Waiting for the next slide to load here. So not only are they layering and painting with the light, I think some of these side windows, I love choir loft windows. I think they really exemplify this idea of American stained glass studios striving to create illuminated mosaics. They're just so fantastic. Look at this incredible jeweled, faceted pieces, these chunks coming up out of the window. How fantastic is that? So is it a Tiffany? I don't know. What does that have to do with the value? I think what I'm trying to impart as I explain all of this, and one of the reasons why I like to start with this explanation of how American stained glass was so tied to the manufacturing of material, is because as we face this massive amount of restoration work to be done, we cannot escape the conversation about value. And value is so a part of the story of these windows, and whether or not they're Tiffany or Lafarge's, they're all a part of this really incredible story. And so I see the disappointment in people's faces when they find out they don't have a Tiffany, and I don't think they should be disappointed. There's so many other reasons out there when you think about it, about why we love stained glass, and the story goes through from this point then into the studios where we're working with it, where we're cutting it up into multiple pieces. There is so much more than whether or not it's a Tiffany. So that brings me to my next point, that I am seeing impact the story of now stained glass restoration in America, and how we tackle this seemingly ever increasing problem. Because why are we fighting so darn hard to save all the glass? We're definitely not fighting this hard to save all the pew cushions. And stained glass started as a trade, right? It's the masonry, it's everything else. It's a building material. So it's a relatively new philosophical problem to be assigning these massive values to the stained glass and defining it and seeking funding and all the things that we're doing. We should remind ourselves that we're doing a fantastic job, first and foremost. And secondly, that these are relatively new problems to tackle in the US especially. So why do we love stained glass? And I think if you think about everything we just talked about, right? When you stand and you look at the stained glass windows and you think about the process that they went through to get into your building, starting with those manufacturers, now you're seeing workbench pictures. You're seeing, actually, these are old, we pulled them out of the archives, the restoration of some of the Darwin Martin House windows here in Buffalo, New York. And you think about the hands that worked to create that installation. One of the things that I think we're seeing, the reason we love stained glass and we're all fighting so hard to save it, is because we can feel the hand of the maker. I'm really excited to be a part of some really groundbreaking research that's happening around this theory and around everything that we're doing to sort of approach the trades a little differently in America, right? Like we just walked through the manufacturing process. You saw the sand getting transformed by heat, then getting thrown onto the table, then getting mixed up, and then the glass hits the table. It gets painstakingly selected at the shop. it gets cut into place. This is all still work done by hand, right? I've given hundreds of tours. I've never met anybody that hates stained glass, whether they are, even church tours and giving tours to people who aren't particularly religious. They still love the windows, and it's the art of light, it's the art of atmosphere, but it's also this incredible handcrafted material that picks up a memory of that as it goes step by step through that process. And when it's made by great craftspeople, all of those marks and details, all of that becomes less and less obvious to the eye, which allows us as viewers to really resonate just with the light, with the atmosphere, with that architectural setting that's been created. And that's why we love it in our buildings. We are getting to experience as viewers this very active event. Unlike looking at a painting in a museum, you're living with the art, right? So every person, every community that's coming through that space, that's using that space, that's having a concert, that's worshiping, that's having all of that is building into this story and creating this architectural setting and this history. And I am finding very much that that is a story we are needing to tell in a very different way as we go after funding, right? Because it's pretty easy to put, it's easier, let's say easier, to say, I've got an irreplaceable Tiffany window. What about the rest of them? What about the rest of these windows? And so the story of community, the story of the building, and then tying the windows into that is something that we are trying to do a better and better job of as we talk about the provenance of stained glass in America and the journey and what it's seen and why it's important in that space, is coming out and tying in the craftsmanship that has been built up over the years, and tying in just how the mastery of those skills, becoming muscle memory, getting built, going into that building, how that all is part of the story of stained glass and the story of that community that has loved that stained glass and given it an increased value. The best work, much like the Darwin Martin house here, the best work should look effortless, and it often does. And I know that that is frustrating for historians all over the country as they try to figure out who made their windows, how they got there. It is so much more common to not know than to know. To not know the face behind that painter. But it should not impact, our ability to have value. So I think moving away from that conversation of, just is it or is it not a Tiffany, is really, really helpful for everybody. Because American stained glass is like no other thing. And I have so many pictures of so many spaces I've gotten to see, so many incredible things. And we don't know. We don't know who made it, but it's still got to be saved. And telling different stories and reframing the narrative is one of the ways we're trying to garner increased support from public and private stakeholders, from the government. Talking about sacred spaces as community hubs has been a big push for us here, and coming in to support those conversations has been a really big push for us here. Because anything that we can do to show the positive impact of keeping those stained glass windows in place, and of that uplifting the human spirit and tying people back to their history, that's not something that we were previously asked to do. A decade ago, we were almost never asked to do that, but now we're getting called in to do more of that. And it's exciting to get to explain to people how this work got to their space in the first place, what it went through for American stained glass to even exist. So I have some slides here. Hang on, because apparently I also have like 4 slides from the cleanup. This is Temple Beth Zion down the street here. Sometimes my favorites, I've got to say, are really hard to get out of my slideshows. It doesn't seem to matter what I do. Has anybody else ever done that? You've like deleted slides and they just like jump back in. How do we save the churches in our landscape? In Buffalo, this is definitely a huge thing. We're trying to save everything we can, but buildings are getting surrounded by new construction. They're losing their sense of place. You know, we're having to make really tough choices. I know we're all having to do that. This is where, as tradespeople, as you know, we really have to straddle a lot of borders. We have to connect and build bridges with the construction trades. We have to connect and build bridges with our preservation community. We have to connect and build bridges with our arts communities, where we have typically never really played ball, because we need to keep this living museum of stained glass alive. And we are finding, as we tie in across those borders, that there is a growing mountain of evidence to help us become more sustainable, as you know, to be a more sustainable part of the preservation story, and of helping do a better job to advocate for the work that needs to be done. I'm sure anybody out there who's sought funding for preservation has heard something along the lines of this saying, that every story needs numbers and every set of numbers needs a story. And that is really truly the case. For instance, the most recent Arts and Economic Prosperity report showed that historic preservation efforts generated $74.7 billion in economic activity in the United States. Stained glass was a part of that story, right? So tying into these stories, helping generate these numbers in the first place, has been a really, really exciting thing to start doing in the last several years. Right here in Buffalo, 86% of our region responded that arts and culture is important to their community's quality of life and livability. If we could just get them to spend as much money on us as they do on the Buffalo Bills, I think that would get a little easier. But like, if our community is saying, 86% of our community is saying that their lives would be negatively impacted if these buildings came down, how do we tie into that? How do we start having that conversation? And that's a really exciting place to be. Too often in preservation, we were finding that the only people sitting at the table were preservationists. And now we're trying to bring people to the table from these other perspectives, from these other silos, so that we can have more conversations about how to save this window, right? What else is going on across our landscape? What else is going on? So Partners for Sacred Spaces is a huge partner of ours, as part of that network that we are building. And they have done incredible studies showing how the structure impacts space. And getting involved with that and talking about the value of stained glass in those structures when they are not primarily used for religious services anymore is enormously important. Being a part of those conversations is really helping create economic values that people can use for fundraising. So just back in 2016, Partners for Sacred Spaces was updating a research study, and that was when we first started getting involved with them, showing that the average historic sacred space in an urban environment generates over $1.7 million annually in economic impact. A huge part of that is tourism, is people coming to see the stained glass windows, right? Getting people off the street to open up that door and come in and see the windows, come in and hear the organs, increasingly helping pilot studies, showing that sacred spaces can be nonprofit hubs and can provide support in a way that very few other commercial spaces can. So maximizing community leverage. And that's really the conversation that sort of where I want to end is like, what are the points that we can take from here? Like, what do we still not know? What are we trying to figure out, right? That we can study, that we can put a number on about cultural life and ethnic origins and the nationalities of people that came and settled in America, and then what happened between then and now, and how does that value come back and impact what we're looking at, and where do we go from here, having built up these spaces and, you know, evolved through, you know, through time to create this sort of very American story that's put together. A really, really interesting piece of feedback I got from some of our European counterparts that came over and that we were working with is they were looking at, we were on a tour of several sacred spaces, and they said, wow, this could never exist in England. And I said, what do you mean by that? Right? Like, is that a bad thing? What are we talking about here? And they just said, it's such a mishmash of culture and pieces and parts as things were built. And that's buried. That was centuries ago for us. That is buried. You would never get away in our historic landscape today in England of these hodgepodge spaces that are partially finished, built over, and all those other things. And I thought that was an interesting perspective because I don't see our buildings that way, right? I do see our buildings as spaces that are at the very beginning of exploring what it means to make tough decisions, right? Like we maybe, and certainly we can't say this everywhere, but you know, we are not going to experience the depth of destruction that England did in 2 world wars. We are not experiencing you know, a lot of the natural catastrophe that has shaped some of the preservation and rebuilding and restructuring that has happened elsewhere. So our decisions that we are making are much more difficult as we look at our spaces that are or not being used. What are we taking down? What are we keeping? And I've seen some really incredible things happen, and I've seen some really sad things happen. And too often the sad things happen because there was a lack of conversation before things got really ugly. One of the projects I visited recently that was really exciting was a church that basically was falling apart. And there was a lot of talk about demolition, and the city created a educational program inside where they carefully supported the parts of the building that were in danger, but then started pulling the building apart in such a way that the students can see the bones of the building. How was the building built, right? My talks start a lot with this theory that I think is somewhat misplaced, that stained glass was a visual literacy thing, right? That stained glass existed and rose to popularity because it illustrated stories for people that could not read. Well, now, if you think about it, a lot of the people that we work with cannot see. They have no idea how masonry works. They have no idea how stained glass works. They have no idea how we built these buildings. And so a lot of the pushback that we get in the trades about like, oh my gosh, that's so expensive. How are we going to do this? This is impossible. We can't save all of this. Is in part because we have lost that visual literacy of how things were made in the first place. The average sacred space in our major urban areas continue to provide massive amounts of volunteer hours to support community programs, massive amounts of economic support, and there's some really, really creative things happening out there that that I think we can all learn from. This is a map of just like these are all the sacred spaces that are just right around me, that I've marked. And you can sort of, see at the bottom that the average congregation in Buffalo, New York, contributes almost $240,000 a year to our local economy. I mean, it's a big deal. And we've got to get outside and partner with other communities that are trying to put these numbers together for us if we're going to make, some inroad into justifying why we want to save all of these spaces. So, so that's the philosophy. Sorry, it's starting to pour rain here and my window's open. That is the philosophy that I am dealing with day in and day out as we do our work and as we continue to support what is a very, very healthy trade to this day in America. Today we have almost 60 large studios still at work in America. We have 45 up and coming emerging professional studios that we work with, and to better support them, the association is very much transitioning into a organization that is very, very outward facing, building bridges with other preservationists, other art groups, government groups, commercial glass makers, because it is a very, very intertwined ecosystem. It's a very diversely rich place, and it has not done us any good to silo ourselves from anybody else. And one of my favorite quotes these days, as I do that work, is written on the wall behind my computer, where you guys can't see it. Usually, if my face was on screen, you would see it behind me. And it's from the book, The Legend of Bagger Vance. It says, "Wisdom is in the hands," and that's very much the mentality sort of we take with ourselves as we go out to connect with people and have these conversations about what we can save and how we're going to make it happen every day. So with that, I wrap up my presentation and I look forward to answering lots and lots of questions.
Thank you, Megan. And if you have any questions, please type those into your chat box now so we can get those answered. I'm about to send everyone in the chat box a link to our Partners with Sacred Places webinar we did a little bit ago, about a year ago. So if you're more interested in learning about their services and grants and so forth that they can provide, you can watch that webinar and get in touch with them as well. So Megan, our first question here is, so let's just say we have a church here and they're beginning to notice that the leading is beginning to bow or separate from the glass. What are some things they can do to prevent more deterioration from happening?
I want you to know that almost every stained glass window I see is bowing, especially toward the bottom. And stained glass can live that way for a long time. It is a bigger problem if it's an almost full fold at the bottom. But the number one reason that happens is because of improper frame maintenance. And maintaining the tracery around the windows is different depending on what region you're in and where you are. I know here in Buffalo, a lot of what I see, and I imagine it's the same where you are, but a lot of what I see is that wood tracery has been painted over and painted over and painted over to instead of being restored, and that it's rotting or giving. And if the wood framing is rotting, then it can't support the bars that are supporting the window. The bars across the window are not holding the window up. They're forcing the weight of the window out to the side into the building. And so if the wood framing or the stone frame or whatever, the stone tracery, whatever it is, if that has not been properly maintained, that's what's contributing to the window bowing, and you can bring in a studio and have them look at it. It is almost never an emergency. So bringing in a studio to look at it and give you a sense of time and a sense of ongoing maintenance and future restoration is a good way to start the planning process.
Thanks, Megan. Next question here is from Gina. She says, our church building in Nashville was built in 1895. How does this relate to the tariffs passed in 1903?
I'm sorry, I missed what you said. The what passed of 1903?
The tariffs.
Oh, I'm sorry. All of the stained glass that was being built are somewhat related to the story of the tariffs, just because that is what was happening with the material at the time. So even if you were built slightly after that, slightly before that, it just sort of gives you a sense of where you were in the formation of an industry. I think because stained glass is so old, most people assume that it has existed in America since the Mayflower arrived, if you will, and most people are just really surprised to learn how young the stained glass industry is in America. I think those of us really involved in the preservation field know that you needed a certain kind of building before you could have a certain kind of architectural artwork and all the other things that kind of go into that. But studios sort of started and sputtered out until there was a concerted community effort to really pass some legislation that gave the industry a fighting chance in America. So I don't know if that fully answers the question, I guess.
Next question here is from Jana. She says, I recently had a large Demi Luna fully restored, and it's already bowing. The restoration company said it's okay and just settled that way. Is that normal?
Yeah, I mean, I guess define recent, because within 5 to 10 years, I guess that's not. I've seen plenty of examples of the stained glass being quote unquote restored, but other major things in the building not being restored. So the window was repaired, but it was put back into a problematic situation, which I think is part of why the trades have to talk to each other better, right? The windows should be the first things out, but the last things back in, and I think that sounds like a really specific case that I'm happy to sort of email with you about. And I'm definitely not throwing any studios under the bus. It's not, I like our studios and the association, we're not a union. You're not required to be a part of the association, but those studios do tend to be more informed about present day issues because they're the ones studying them. We're coming together to study problems. And not every studio chooses to do that, and that's fine.
And Barbara just wanted to let you know that she's giving a shout out to her great grandfather, Joseph Flanagan, who was the first president of the Stained Glass Association.
Woo!
So,
yes. Oh my God. Harrison, Ohio. How could I forget? The most important fact of that story is that we were founded in Ohio. Yes, I love it.
Let's see. Next is just a comment from Janet. Here in Cleveland, we are working with the Cleveland Restoration Society's Sacred Partners Initiative to provide no-cost assessments of buildings, including stained glass, roofing, HVAC, foundation, mortar issues, etc. The comprehensive report, let's scroll down a little bit to see the rest of this. Provides excellent foundation for prioritizing issues and budgeting with owners. So yes, there are several resources in Ohio as well, as Janet just mentioned. And definitely, particularly when it comes to sacred places, I mean, there's a lot of foundations out there, but at the same time, it's, a lot of issues all happening at the same time, as Megan mentioned earlier. So, sometimes you have to really start planning ahead for these things to get repaired, along with roofing issues and other things in sacred places. So start reaching out if your church has any issues. There's a lot of partnerships out there to kind of help you get some funding for those projects.
Yeah, listen, it's tough. Like a lot of places that I go into, like are not even talking sort of across the same city. And so you'll have, somebody that's figured some things out, and that information isn't even traveling across the same region. One of the reasons that we moved our headquarters into a sacred space, into Trinity here in Buffalo, was because we wanted to like get in on the ground, to get, you'll be able to like really be a part of the process, and and not just like sit in some garage or some office somewhere. Like, we work on computers, we could do this from a coffee shop. But just for instance, a couple of weeks ago, so we have since we've moved into Trinity, we've brought 9 other nonprofits into the building to rent space in what was the old church offices here to help support the campus. But we're starting to attract some attention. And a couple of weeks ago, we were broken into and vandalized from the inside, and offices were broken into, and cash was stolen from nonprofits, and it was really tough. And we said something to some friends down the street, and they said, "Oh, why didn't you go out for that $150,000 security grant from the Department of Homeland Security?" And I said, "What the hell are you talking about? Like, I'm out here searching for grants all day, every day, and I'd never heard of that grant." And it turns out we were overqualified, given what we've been struggling with, to get money for like security systems. So would I love to spend $150,000 on stained glass tomorrow? I definitely would. But if a brick gets thrown through it the next day, I'm right back up the same creek. So oftentimes, even though stained glass is our primary focus, we're finding that we're a really critical part of other efforts. And we're doing a lot more to try to build community in a lot of different ways to help make sure that resources, because resources are not, it's not a pie, right? Like, if I take a piece of pie, somebody else isn't getting the pie. In a lot of cases, the louder we are and the more we work together, the more pie there is. And I think that's a major goal of ours.
Thanks, Megan. One final question for you here is how would a stained glass window be repaired or restored if there are segments from that window that are missing?
Oh my gosh, be still my heart. That is a toughie that we get far too often. And the answer to that, as is the answer to all stained glass repair questions, is that it depends. There are multiple things that you can do, and in each situation, we work with the community to try to build a plan that meets their budget, that meets their needs, that honors where they are in the journey of restoration. I just the other day packing taped sections of a window back together. I was at a soup kitchen, and there was a fight, and somebody threw a can of soup, I think it was actually corn, through Jesus's head, because of course they did. And we packing taped it until more can be done, until some other things can happen. Unfortunately, we're struggling to find photos, we're struggling to find documentation. Luckily, we found a lot of the pieces, but there's a lot of situations where if something happens in the night, you can't find the pieces, you don't have photos, you're trying to work from memory. You can see how there's just a vast array of options, and many of those things are appropriate, right? We're not gonna poo-poo someone because they didn't have documentation already hiding off-site. And so we try to work with people where they are. We try to help them find any documentation we can, and then make the best plan with whatever information we could get about the window before it was broken.
Thanks, Megan, and thank you again for doing this webinar with us today. It was wonderful. Everyone, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, you'll be getting a recording of this webinar tomorrow. I'll include a link to the Partners for Sacred Places webinar we did earlier, and I'll include some information as well on how to get in touch with Megan if you have any more detailed questions you'd like to ask her in the future. So thanks once again, Megan. Thanks everyone for attending today. We hope you have a good day. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.